The first was called Suing the Pope, which aired in 2002, March of 2002 on the BBC in the UK, and then was transmitted into Ireland as well. And that was about my own case, because I had a legal case pending against the Church here in Ireland and against the Vatican. And that film and that case really kicked off a whole new approach to these issues here in Ireland. I mean, my case had been pending since the mid-1990s, so I've been working on the issues for quite some time. But it led to the resignation of a bishop here in Ireland, the first time a bishop had resigned because of failings to properly deal with clerical sexual abuse. And then through my work in campaigning for state investigations, it led to the first state investigation in Ireland, the Ferns Inquiry, into the sexual abuse of children by Roman Catholic priests. Now the inquiry wasn't focused on did abuse happen, because that was well proven and well accepted. The inquiry was into systems. So it was, how did the church authorities, both in the Diocese of Ferns here in Ireland, but also the wider church authorities, respond to allegations, complaints or concerns about the rape and abuse of children by priests, and how did state agencies respond? So what did the police here in Ireland do? What did social services and child protection services do if they received complaints or if they had concerns?
When did you start investigating this? You said in 1990?
Well, I reported my own experiences of abuse to the authorities, to the police here in Ireland in February of 1995.
Okay, so you were personally abused? By a
Catholic priest.
A Catholic priest. Yeah. Okay, so all the cases and all the investigating that you've done has always revolved around the Vatican?
No. Probably track you back even further than to tell you about the entry into this. I was repeatedly sexually assaulted and raped by a Roman Catholic priest from the age of 14 until I was I was gone 17. It was almost 3 years, and that was from 1981 up until late 1983.
So 81?
81.
Or 91?
81.
81 to 83.
Up until late 83, so it was from sort of the spring of 81 up until December of 83. So almost 3 years.
Okay, and you were part of the Catholic Church?
I grew up in Ireland. In Ireland at that time, everything was part of the Catholic Church.
Okay.
I mean, it's still the case in 2010 that nearly every primary school, every elementary school in Ireland is a Catholic school.
Okay.
And that's in 2010.
Okay.
So in 1981, the Catholic Church's presence and control and power across society was absolute. I went to a Catholic school. The youth group I was a member of was a Catholic youth group. I sang in church at Mass. I'd been an altar boy. Everything I did in my life as a young person revolved around church.
Okay. So I'm just trying to understand the relationship between, let's say, you and the priest. Would it have been during the time you were an altar boy? Would it have been during a youth group?
It was during a youth group. I was very involved, as I said, in church, and then I was at an event with my youth group and was approached by this priest. Nothing unusual about that, because I met priests and religious all the time. I went to a church school. And he just chatted to me for a while, and that was the end of the conversation. And I hadn't met him before. And he was based in I actually didn't even know where he was based then, but 2 weeks later, late one evening, and I remember it being dark, he arrived at my home and knocked on the door, and because he was a priest, he was immediately invited in. And he said he wanted to talk to me, that he'd met me at a church event and that he'd been very impressed by me. So he was invited in, given the chair by the fire, and tea was made, and he was left to talk to me. And I found out then he'd been newly appointed to a parish, a rural parish that was about half an hour away from where I lived. I lived in a small town called Wexford in the southeast of Ireland. His parish was in a very small rural village, a little place called Powell-Fur, which was about half an hour's drive away. And he was in the house for a couple of hours talking to me, finding out what I was interested in. He was grooming me. In fact, that's what he was doing. He was grooming me, even though I obviously wouldn't have realised that at the time. And he very quickly picked up upon my desire as a 14-year-old boy who wanted to be a man, to get out into the world and to be playing a role in my community and to be involved in things and to be, part of what was happening. I had become, very excited about what it meant to be a teenager and to become political and to become concerned with society and what was happening all around me. And he told me that he had just moved to his parish and that he was starting a youth group and a folk group that would sing at Mass, and he was trying to put lots of new youth organisations together in the parish, and it could really do with somebody like me to help him, that he thought I had a lot to offer. So I was very excited by that. First of all, kind of flattered and stunned, but in a really good way, that this priest, this important person, thought that I had something valuable to contribute, and that I could do something important for him to help him. And he asked me would I come down to his parish and help him in his parish. And I said yes, if my mother allows me to, of course I will.
Help him in what essence?
With his youth group and with his youth organisations and with putting those structures in place in his parish, help him in his work in the parish. So I was excited and flattered at the idea that I might get a chance to do that kind of thing. It's the kind of thing I was interested in. So I said if my mother allowed me to, I would, and he laughed and said, of course you will. There was no question of that, and he was right. I mean, nobody in Ireland then would have questioned any decision or request from a priest. It was just automatic that we would do what...
Like a man of God.
Yeah, what they wanted us to do. I mean, they were... priests in the church were the real community leaders in our country. And that's not just at a local level. I mean, the centre of every community was the parish priest. The ultimate authority at a social level in every community was the parish priest. In truth, the Catholic Church had more power politically in Ireland than any other organisation, including political parties. And governments routinely deferred to the authority of the Church. I mean, I had senior government ministers confirmed to me that up until relatively recently, they would have said this to me in 03, 04, up until relatively recently, really up to the turn of this century and into this century, it was normal practice for major social policy or legislative proposals to be passed by the church hierarchy before they even went to Parliament.
So they go hand in hand.
Yeah. They didn't go hand in hand. The church was above
the power.
The church was above politics. I mean, the church was more powerful than political parties, and it dictated the agenda, and it had done for very many years here in Ireland. So their power was absolute locally, and was frankly also absolute at the national level, and it would never have been questioned.
So you mentioned that you started helping at the church.
That's what I expected to happen.
Okay.
My mother agreed that I could go down and help him, and a week or so later he arrived to bring me down to his parish. And that first time that we went there, I can remember the drive down. It was late at night, it was dark. We stopped off on the way, and he brought me into some parishioners' house because he stopped off to have tea and visit parishioners, which was kind of odd because he just brought me along with him. Again, I wouldn't question that, and neither did anybody else. And when we got to the house, I can remember, because we came down this, it was a very windy road. You come around a very sharp corner and drive up a long driveway. And I could see down at the end of the driveway the house, and there was like a converted garage that had now doors and windows instead of garage doors in it. And I could see lights on and hear voices and music coming from it. So obviously this was the youth group. The youth group was meeting. So when we got to the house, I expected that I'd get out and go in and meet the youth group, but that didn't happen. He brought me straight into the house, and he told me to sit in a room that was an office, and told me to wait. And I remember sitting in the room and thinking, I thought I was going to
meet the youth.
Maybe that'll be tomorrow then. Okay. And a little while later he came back in and he had told them to go home. And then he said to me, well, we talked for a while longer, and then eventually he said, well, it's time you should go to bed. And he said, oh, there's only one bed in the house, because I've only just moved in, and he'd only been there a couple of months, I think. And I can remember thinking, thank God I've got pyjamas, because I was 14 and I'd stopped wearing pyjamas to bed. But because I was going down to the priest's house, I'd gotten my mother to buy me pyjamas. And I remember just thinking, well, okay, that's okay, well, at least I've got pyjamas. And he told me where the room was and told me to follow him up whenever I was ready to go to bed. So I went and got ready to go to bed, put on my new pyjamas, taking them out of their packaging, brushed my teeth and walked up the stairs. And when I went into the room, he was already in the bed. He was sitting in the bed, rubbing hand cream into his hands. And he told me to get into the bed. So I got into the bed and turned over, and turned out the light and lay down in the bed. And it was very strange and uncomfortable, but I mean, again, I just needed to get to sleep and not think. It was just odd, but not. I just felt uncomfortable. I didn't feel like anything terrible was going to happen. I didn't have any idea of what was going to happen, but it was odd. It was a strange feeling. I was embarrassed and uncomfortable. But eventually I started to drift off and fall asleep after maybe 20 minutes, half an hour, something like that. And then as I was falling off asleep, I felt him move in the bed, and he moved over in the bed and was behind me, and then he put his arm across my waist. He flung his arm across my waist, and I kind of woke up and froze, and I went, oh, maybe he's asleep, maybe I don't, and I just froze. But then he started to touch me, and then he sexually assaulted me.
Did you say anything?
No, I froze completely.
But you remember everything?
Everything. Yeah, no, I never, I mean, that's one thing, I never forgot anything that happened over those years.
So you never told anyone?
No.
When was the first time you spoke out?
The first time I told anybody was, and I didn't even really name it, I told one of my sisters. This continued on for 2.5 years, and it started from that first episode, which was a minor sexual assault, and built from there where I mean, after it had happened, I felt sick and guilty and confused and frightened and shocked. Not least because the worst part of this was I was a 14-year-old boy and my body responded to what he did. And that was the most difficult thing for me then, was, oh my God, what have I done? What does this mean? What's going on? And he used that confusion and my willingness to blame myself to blame me. So immediately after it happened, and I ran out of the room and eventually called him down, decided I'll talk to him about this and I'll be clear that this can't happen, and not confront him, take control, try and deal with this, fix it somehow, because I don't know what to do. I felt I was going insane when I ran out of the room, but then I just thought, okay, well, what? So I told him that this must never happen again, and he said, you're right, you must never do this again. So immediately he was telling me, this is what I've done. And nothing else happened for the rest. I was down there one more day, and then he drove me back home. And
did he tell you not to tell anyone?
I wasn't going to tell anyone. He knew that. He didn't need to say that to me, because I was so sick with guilt. And as we were going home the next day, he was a very overpowering personality. He talked all the time. He filled every space. No matter what was going on, he filled every space. And all the way home, he's talking and talking, and I'm just thinking, okay, we'll be home soon, we'll be home soon. And I could just then kind of relax and try and work out what's happening and just be safe. I just knew I'd be safe once I got home. And when we were a few minutes away from my house, he stopped talking. And then we came closer, and I was getting more and more, not excited, but more and more anticipating seeing my home and feeling okay, because I'll be home, I can get out of the car, I can go to my room, I can have a shower, I can do whatever I need to do, I can just not deal with this, just not think about this, I can do something else. And I'm thinking, okay, we're going to come around the bend and down the hill, and then I'll see the trees at the edge of my house and the chimney, and I'll be home. And next minute he spoke, and he said, I'm worried about you, you have a problem. And
trying to blame you for
yeah. And then he said, I'm a priest and I have a responsibility to do something about it. So I didn't know what he was going to say next. And then the next thing that he said was, so I have two choices. Either I can talk to your parents, and he paused. And at that point, I mean, I didn't scream out loud, but I was screaming inside my head, and I felt like jumping out of the car. I was so terrified because we're minutes from my house. I thought everything was going to be okay, and now the priest is going to tell my parents, he's going to tell my father what I've done, who I am. And I was terrified. And I didn't have time to think any of this through, and plus I didn't understand what was going on. Even though I was 14, I just didn't understand what was happening. And then he said, you can come back down to me and I'll help you. And I did know that when he said, come in.
courage, not so much.
Oh, did you just see my head?
No, I think that was a little your head. It's really, really good.
Okay, sure.
Thanks a million.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks,
Wow,
Bernadette.
that's pretty.
Thanks, Bernadette.
Good.
So somewhere I knew when he said, help me, that I knew what that meant. I knew that he meant I should go back down there again, and that if I went back down there again, he was going to do this again. I mean, I could see it, I knew it. But I also heard the other bit, which is I could talk to your parents. So as is often the case, it then became about short-term survival. What do I have to do to make this okay right now? Because I don't know what to do, I don't know how to fix this, I can't control this, what can I do to make this okay now? So I agreed to go back down. And of course he didn't help me. He continued to assault me. And it just got worse and worse and worse.
And this took place for 2.5 years?
2.5 years, yeah. And I tried to say, I mean, the second time he came and got me, it became clear that that was going to happen again, because it happened again. And then the third time I tried not to go, and I told my mother I didn't want to go. And I was upstairs in my room, and he was down at the bottom of the stairs, and my mother was coming up and down the stairs between the two of us, and she was coming up to me, and I was saying, I don't want to go, and she was going down to me saying, he has to come, he's told me he's going to come and help me this weekend. She's coming up and down. And I was a very good child. You know, I did what I was told, and I was very compliant, and I wanted to help all the time, and that's kind of what I was like. And so my mother was confused by this, and then I was crying, and she said, what's wrong? And I was trying to find a way to tell her, but I couldn't say it. I couldn't say out loud what was happening. I mean, I didn't have the language or the words, because, I mean, in Ireland, sex didn't happen at that point. Nobody spoke about sex. Never mind the idea of an adult man having sex with a teenage boy, or child sex release. Nobody spoke about these things. So I didn't even have the language. I knew what had happened was awful. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't have the language to even say it. And this was a priest, so I couldn't say. And eventually, he convinced her that I was simply trying to get out of the commitment I'd made to him, and that he said to her, you know, it's obvious he's made arrangements with his friends, and now he wants to do that and not honour the commitment he made to me, and I think that would be very bad for him, and you should tell him he has to come. So I was told I had to go with him. And I remember getting into the car that day and him just looking at me with this smirk on his face, because he'd won, he'd beaten me. And that was when I gave up. That day I gave up. The idea that I would, and it just got, and there were times when I, you know, resisted or fought back, and he would become more aggressive, he became more violent, he raped me, and it just became more and more brutal over time.
So it was always just one priest?
Just one, yeah.
Okay, and did
that was
you know,
enough.
Right, and it was just, we were speaking to other people,
With,
you know,
yeah,
I've had a couple of them. Do you know of anyone else that he abused, or any of your friends that were, or anything like that? Not
at the time. I mean, if I fast forwarded then, when I finally got away, it was when I was 17, and I was so depressed that I was very suicidal, and I could see no way out, and I realised I was either going to have to get out of life or run away. So I ran, and I left my hometown. I just packed a suitcase and came here to Dublin, and spent 9 months homeless in Dublin on the streets, trying to put my life back together again. And then gradually and eventually I did, and so I left in January of 1984, and over the next 10 years just started to put my life back together, or at least, I mean, I ran, and by 1994 I'd started to stop running, if that makes any sense. But of course when you start to stop running, the things that you're running from start to catch up. And it's not that I had ever forgotten, I hadn't, but I started to become concerned about what might still be happening. And for the first time I thought, well, what if he's still doing this? And the last time that I saw him, the last time that he assaulted me, he knew I was desperate to get away. He offered me money if I would find somebody, as he said, like me but younger than me, who would sleep with him. I ran. That was the last time I ever saw him, because I mean, at that point, I had no sense of my own self-value. I really didn't care about what happened to me. I didn't think I was worth anything. So whatever anybody was going to do to me didn't matter. But the idea that he was going to try and do this to somebody else, and that he wanted me to make that happen, just horrified me. And that was the last part of my decision to run, and I ran.
Is he still alive?
No,
Is the legal case that was pending?
it's all over. Do you want me to catch you up to that as quickly as I can?
No, I was just trying to understand if it
Yeah.
was just one case, and I wanted to know
No,
like, how
it's
that
not,
had-
but I need to tell you how that
Okay,
evolved.
perfect.
So by 1994 I was living in London. I moved to London in 1986. And from about the summer of 1994 on, summer of 1994, I made a clear decision that I was going to have to do something about this, but I didn't know what. I mean, I still wasn't ready to say what this was, just this thing. I need to do something about that. But I couldn't even let myself acknowledge the words or what had actually happened. I had to come up with another way of... I couldn't even say it out loud to myself. I wasn't ready to deal with it. But I knew I needed to do something. And I had told one of my sisters, not long after I ran from home, I had brief contact with one of my sisters. And I had told her that something had happened. So she had some idea of it. So I spoke to her first. And because I left my family, I didn't go home for 4 years. I ran. When I left, I didn't go back for 4 years.
So they knew something was wrong. But they just
well, I vanished
Right, okay.
for 4 years. Yeah. But when I went back, 4 years later, I was 21 when I went back. We never spoke about all of that. We were like everybody else in this society. We were silent. Even about the things we knew, we couldn't speak about them, and we couldn't speak about them to each other. So my family was as much part of the silence, even after I disclosed enough for people to know what was happening. None of us could speak about it. We wouldn't speak about it.
Because you finally told your family.
I told my sister
You told your sister, okay.
when I was 18, and she went back and told my father that something had happened. And then 3 years later, when I went home, I'm back, but we never spoke about it.
So she didn't discredit you. She believed you. Obviously, that's why you ran, but they didn't.
Yeah.
they didn't.
Yeah, but I don't think they could deal with what had happened either. They couldn't even get their heads around it either, I suppose. And my father and I had a very difficult relationship. I thought he was angry with me. I was very frightened of disappointing him. I mean, if we were in a room together from that point on, there had to be somebody else in the room. It wasn't that we fought or we argued, we just could not stay in the same room together. It was just too uncomfortable, and we couldn't relate to each other at all. So that was very difficult, and that continued on for 7 or 8 years. And then in 1994, when I decided I needed to do something, I again spoke to my sister, my older sister, who I'd told much earlier on. And we started to think about how we might do it. And initially I thought, well, I'll write to the bishop. I didn't think I'll go to the police. Even after 10 years away from the church, my first thought was, I'll tell the church and they'll do something. I'll go to the church. I won't go to the police, I'll go to the church. Thankfully I didn't, and because I just struggled with working out what to do. And then finally on New Year's Eve 1994, 1995, at a party in my sister's house, my father broke. And he brought my sister and a friend of his into a room and wept. And my father was not an emotional man. He didn't express his emotions. But he said that he couldn't live with what had happened to me. He needed to deal with what had happened, and something had to be done about it.
So he acknowledged it at that point.
Yeah. And what I didn't know was that a couple of years earlier, the priest had tried to contact me through my father. He had rung my father looking to find out where I was. I didn't know why, and my father didn't find out. My father just dismissed the call and wouldn't speak to him, but also didn't do anything more about it. So when I got that call from my sister about this, and she said, well, Colin wants to do something too, he's been talking about this. When she rang me and told me about my father being upset and naming it, I immediately phoned him, and we had the first real conversation that we'd ever had in our lives, to be honest. And we agreed that we would do something about this together. So a month later, in February of 1995, I travelled back from London to Wexford, my hometown, and made a statement to the police about the abuse.
What did they say?
And the detective who took the statement was very, very good. It took 2 days to give a 2-page statement. It was so difficult to get the words out, but I did it. And when I was making that statement, I thought that this was one bad man who had done something very bad to me, and that if I told the police about it, they would investigate it. He would be asked to answer for that, and maybe it would go into court, and I would then have to go into court and give evidence, and the judge would decide, or the jury would decide who they believed. But that was fine. That just needed to happen. What I didn't know was that there was a much, much bigger story. And as soon as the detective started to investigate the case, Within weeks, 5 other men who were boys at the time that they were raped and assaulted by the same priest made statements. So very quickly, within a number of months, he was facing a total of 66 charges of sexual assaults on a total of 6 boys, 6 children, 6 teenage boys.
One priest.
One priest. And that was just the beginning of it.
Right, that we know of, because maybe a lot of kids didn't do that.
Well, I know much more now. And even then I thought, well, this is just, my God, he's been doing this so much, that's okay, but he'll be prosecuted. And I felt both horrified that others had been abused and also relieved that there were others to back up what I was saying, and now we thought maybe we'd have a conviction. But then over the next year or year and a half, I began to hear suggestions that more was known about this priest. I heard suggestions that complaints had been made in like 1987 to the church about him. So this was after he had abused me, but he had still been a priest. He was still a priest working in a parish when I made my complaint. And it was only after I made my complaint to the police that he was told to step aside from the parish. And he wasn't allowed to work in the parish.
Did he just switch?
No, he was in a different parish then, but he was put on administrative leave. So he was not allowed to work in a parish, but he was still going into hospitals and visiting children and families. But he wasn't meant to work as a priest. But from 1983, when I left, until 1995, he had been working as a priest, as the manager of schools, working in schools, teaching kids, controlling schools, because the church controls most of the schools, running youth groups. He even had youth groups in the basement of his house at various points. And I didn't know it then, but he was raping and abusing countless children all around him, and had been for years. But the first suggestion I heard that the church knew was from 1987, which obviously came after he'd abused me, but still, if they had had complaint in 1987, why was he still a priest until 1995? So I began to be concerned about that, and I dug and asked some more questions. And then I heard more and more suggestions of more and more complaints. And then for the first time I heard a suggestion that there had been a complaint about him before he was ordained a priest. That when he was a seminarian in college, he had sexually assaulted a group of Boy Scouts on a camping trip, and that a complaint had been made to the church and to the Scouting Association, but that he had been ordained anyway.
Do you believe that, I'm just trying to get in maybe more information about the deprivation, so besides right here in Ireland, do you believe that this is something that goes on worldwide?
Yes. I don't believe it, I know it. You know, there are things that we now know for fact. Even in that case, I mean, the responsibility for what happened in that case extended way beyond the Irish Church. The Vatican was made aware of the case. Parishioners made complaints directly to the Papal Nuncio, the Pope's ambassador to Ireland, about this priest's conduct. They talked about his influence over young people and children. They talked about his abuse of the sacraments and his bullying of people. And the Papal Nuncio responded to say that the Pope, the Holy See, was aware of their concerns. So by the time I saw this letter, I knew that the Vatican had been told that there were problems with this priest, and I knew that before he was ordained, the church had been told that he was abusing children, but they had ordained him anyway. So in this case, I knew that the Vatican either knew or should have known that this man was a risk to children before he was ordained a priest, but certainly not long after he was ordained a priest, and that they did nothing about it. And as soon as I found that out, I decided that it simply wasn't a matter of having the police investigate and the courts prosecute this man, that the church itself needed to be investigated and prosecuted. But the police were never going to do that. That had to be me. So I took a legal action, a civil action, against the Vatican and against the diocese. So I sued the Pope and the diocese to force them to disclose what they knew about this priest. At the same time, I started to become aware of other cases. And then the documentary that I made, which carried on, which went out in 2001, brought out a huge number of other cases, not just here in Ireland, but we began to hear about cases right around the world. So we knew about many, many other cases in Ireland of hundreds of priests, many hundreds of priests here in Ireland who had been raping and abusing, of religious brothers, of monks, of nuns, who had been abusing, both physically and sexually abusing children as well. So we knew it was a huge issue. But then we also saw cases in Canada, in Australia, in the USA, in the UK. So it was very quickly apparent to me that this was a systemic issue and a global issue for the global church. And that became then the focus of my work and of my campaigning, to try to force the church to reveal the truth about both the scale of abuse by clergy, but about the fact that it had willfully and deliberately covered up that abuse and acted to silence victims, to protect the church, and to move priests from parish to parish to parish, where they continued to rape and abuse children with impunity. And I knew that for a fact, certainly, by the late 1990s. And then it was about proving that.
So that's how you came across that document, the
Crimen Celestationis, yeah. I mean, that document was revealed in about 2003. It came out through a number of legal disclosures that were happening in other parts of the world. But the investigation that I forced into the Diocese of Ferns here in Ireland also dealt with that document. And the inquiry, which was headed by a Supreme Court judge here in Ireland, was very clear in the view that this was the first Vatican policy it had discovered that laid out how cases of priests who abused children were to be dealt with by the Church, and that it required absolute secrecy above all else, and that all information should be transferred to Rome and should be managed within the Church. So the inquiry established that in law here in Ireland, and on the basis of that, I decided that we needed to start to deal with this in an international way, and that's why I went to the BBC with the proposal that we should make a film that I would front and present, where we dealt with cases from Ireland, from other parts of Europe, from the United States, but in particular I wanted to go to the Global South, I wanted to go to Latin America to show what was happening in the Church there. Because we knew that wherever scandals had erupted and wherever the media were looking, the Church would eventually, first of all it would deny and say it wasn't happening. Then it would say, oh, it's just one or two priests. Then it would say, oh well, it's the fault of the media who are out to get the Church, or it's homosexuals who are doing all of these things to children, even if the children were girls. It would say all of these different things to try to say it's nothing to do with us. It blamed society. At one point they were saying that society was now so corrupt and hypersexualized that it had infected even good men who'd been given serious moral training by the Church. So it was everybody's fault but the Church. But I knew that they were also saying that things were changing, that they were putting in place better child protection practice. But I also knew that that was only happening in countries where victims like myself speaking out had forced media attention, had forced public outrage, and had forced the Church to appear to do something. And I wanted to see what was happening in countries where there hadn't been significant scandal or significant public attention. So I started to look, and the non-English speaking world then became very important, because most of the scandals emerged first in English speaking countries, and because of the nature of the English speaking media, that was mainly contained within those countries. So I looked at Brazil in particular and discovered cases in Brazil that were very current. So we made the film in 2006, and we dealt with a case that emerged in 2005, from 2003 to 2005 on.
What about Latin America?
Well, we were aware of cases, we were aware of issues in Costa Rica, in Chile, in other countries as well, but we were at very significant numbers of cases in Brazil. We saw suggestions, for instance, or reports that 10% of all priests in Brazil had been accused of sexual misconduct. We began to discover cases of where, thankfully, in Brazil, some priests had been prosecuted. But we also saw suggestions that priests had been moved from place to place. And in the case of Irish priests, another reason why we went to Brazil is because we were dealing with one particular priest from the diocese I was from here in Ireland, who had had complaints against him from 1974 onwards, and who had in the late 1980s been sent to São Paulo to work in São Paulo, and he'd been there for 17 years. And even after the scandals emerged here, and even after the investigation happened and all of these cases were disclosed, I discovered that he was still working in a favela in São Paulo, and that he was still allowed to remain in ministry in São Paulo.
He's still alive?
He's alive now, but he's out of the priesthood. Because in the end we didn't feature the case in the film, because we discovered other cases in Brazil that were Brazilian, and that was where we needed to focus. But as a result of the inquiry, he was taken out of Brazil and was eventually laicized. He was eventually removed from the priesthood. But up until 2005, despite the inquiry starting in 2003, he was still in ministry as a priest in Brazil, despite the fact that the Catholic Church had records which showed that they had complaints about him abusing girls from 1974. So I was very worried about the transfer of offending priests to particularly the Global South and particularly to developing countries. And whilst Africa and less developed countries were particularly hard to get into and uncover, Latin America was perhaps easier to get into because the media was more developed, civil society was more developed, there was perhaps some greater level of openness to beginning to look at these issues. But we started to be able to show that offending priests had also been sent from Europe and from North America into Latin America. There are many cases in Mexico and in other parts of the world where priests were simply transferred out of their home jurisdictions and sent into global southern countries in particular.
You mentioned Latin America. Actually, there was recently, I believe, in Chile, there was a statement made by the Vatican relationship between
Cecilio Bertoni.
homosexuality. Yeah. Any relation, or how do you feel about that?
Well, first of all, it should be recognised that Cardinal Bertoni is not just another cardinal, he's the Secretary of State for the Vatican. He is the head he effectively is the head of the Vatican's external relationships with other states. The Vatican, remember, is a city-state. It's not just a religion, it has statehood. So it has a particular position under international law. So when he made these statements, he wasn't making them as an individual. He was the Vatican Secretary of State, the Pope's number 2. And he said a number of things. I mean, first of all, he said something that I think is true. He said that there's no direct relationship between celibacy and pedophilia. And I think that's a very sensible statement. I don't accept for emotion. Do that again. He made one very sensible statement where he said that there was no direct relationship between celibacy and pedophilia, and I think that's absolutely true. I think it's ridiculous to suggest that because a man is required to be celibate, he'll then suddenly decide, oh, I know, I need to have sex, I'll rape a child. No, he won't. And in many cases we know of priests and religious who go on and have consensual sexual relationships and long-term relationships with other adults. That's a matter for the church, that's a matter for them, but it's not a criminal matter. Celibacy doesn't turn men into pedophilia, or into pedophiles. Celibacy does not turn men into pedophiles. That inclination is a very different kind of dysfunction. But he then went on to say 2 other things that I vehemently disagree with. And one is that homosexuality is a cause of pedophilia, and he said that research backs that up. It does not. There is no such research. And he also said that the church had never willfully covered up or impeded investigations into child sexual abuse by priests. Let's deal with the first one first, the issue of homosexuality. It's a nonsense to create that link. The simple fact is that the majority of sexual violence in this world is perpetrated upon women and girls. So the majority of sexual abuse that happens to girl children. Most of it not within the church context. Most abuse that happens in family context and in other contexts. And when we talk about the causes of sexual violence against women, we don't say that heterosexuality causes sexual violence. We don't say that heterosexuality causes pedophilia. We don't deal with it in that way. It's a ridiculous concept. My background is as a psychotherapist, and I've worked as a clinician with sex offenders as well. And this whole approach to an understanding of pedophilia is a nonsense. And on the part of the Vatican, it's something they've repeatedly tried to do, to pick upon people who might be marginalised, who might be seen themselves as in some way deviant or outside of society or suspicious, and blame them for what's happening. Take the focus off the church and make it about homosexuality.
Scapegoat.
Absolutely turn them into a scapegoat. And it's a lie, it's deceitful, it's dishonest, it's frankly disgusting. You know, I often find myself wondering what Christ would say if he heard some of the things that the church currently says and does.
Well, Genesis 2:8 says it's not convenient for a man to be alone.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
And that's why I asked the question about celibacy, because a lot of people may say want to abstain from having even sweets when you're trying to go on a diet. That's actually when you activate something in your body where that's when you want chocolate most. I'm just making that statement just because
what you then want is chocolate. You don't want salt. Right. So for an adult man who's being required, or for a woman who's being required not to have, who's required to be celibate. First of all, remember, by the way, celibacy is not, you're not allowed to have sexual relations. Celibacy is you're not allowed to marry. There's a difference. Chastity means you're not allowed to have sex or sexual relations. Celibacy means you're not allowed to marry. But of course, in the Catholic Church, sex outside of marriage is sinful. So clearly celibacy means that you don't have sex, because you can't get married and you're not meant to have sex unless you're married. Now, it's amazing the kind of mental gymnastics that people can do with all of this. Because there's even rationalizations where it was viewed that somehow by some people, if they were having sex with children, that wasn't a breach of celibacy because it somehow wasn't the same thing, somehow in their mind. Well, I mean, first of all, let's be clear about one thing. One of the greatest problems with the Church's attitude to this issue generally is that there's no respect for the innate value of children as full human beings in and of their own right. I mean, from a human rights perspective, for instance, and I work for Amnesty International obviously now, if you look, for instance, at the Vatican assigned the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. But if you look at the reservation that it entered into its signature of the convention, it said that children's rights are derived from their status within the family. In other words, children's rights are not unique, individual and inalienable to them as individual human beings. They're instead derived from their position within this other social construct that's headed by parents. So the Church does not recognise or understand or truly value the unique nature of children's rights and the individual and inalienable rights that all children have. And that's a fundamental issue in understanding why the Church has the attitude that it has towards this issue, I think. But I mean, back to the question of homosexuality and paedophilia, it's just a nonsense. I mean, on the most basic level, you know, as I've already said, we don't talk about heterosexuality causing the rape of women and girls. And it's a nonsense then to suggest that somehow homosexuality causes the rape and abuse of boys and men. It doesn't.
I want to take it back to the Vatican though, because we, like I said, trying to get in-depth information as to why do they have immunity, how do they have immunity, how has this come about, how come no one's doing anything about it, or what is being done about it, specifically here in Ireland and then perhaps in
Sure.
books.
Well, I mean, we can talk, I think, perhaps most easily, actually, to understand the whole question of the Vatican immunity from accountability in law. We'd have to talk about the Vatican as a global institution and as a state. So we'll deal with it perhaps in the international context first. I suppose, first of all, most common law has evolved from church law. So, you know, the first laws that were established at the international level really came from church law. So it has it's always strongly influenced the development of law. The notion of sovereign immunity and diplomatic immunity, for instance, comes from, and it's connected with the idea of papal infallibility. So, you know, neither the king nor the pope could do any wrong. That notion of immunity comes from that concept, and it's quite an ancient concept at this point. If we track it forward then, in a deal signed with Benito Mussolini that brought about the creation of the Vatican city-state, the Church acquired statehood, and the Pope, as head of state, is sovereign and head of that state. The papacy is actually one of the few remaining absolute monarchies in the world. The papacy politically, if you want to separate the notion of the religion and talk about the political entity that exists, the state that exists, it is an absolute monarchy, but an elected monarchy, where the Pope is elected by cardinals and becomes the absolute ruler of that state. And on that basis, the Holy See, which represents the Vatican city-state, again another element of papacy, appoints ambassadors to countries, and those ambassadors have all of the protections of international law as diplomats. So they have diplomatic immunity, and the Pope as head of state can assert sovereign immunity from legal actions taken in individual countries against the Pope. So I knew, for instance, when I decided to sue the Pope through the Irish courts, that I could only succeed if the Vatican permitted the suit. So I knew that the Vatican would be able to assert diplomatic immunity and prevent the case from going ahead and prevent themselves from being drawn into the case. But what I was focused on was forcing them to do that. I mean, my ideal scenario would have been that the church would have agreed to come into court and tell the truth. But I was determined to either see that happen or to force them to assert man-made law, to refuse to tell the truth about what they knew about the rape and abuse of children by their priests. And I thought if I could expose that they would use this, that was almost as important as forcing them into court and getting them to actually disclose what they knew. And of course, in my case, that's what they did. They asserted diplomatic immunity to prevent the lawsuit from going ahead against the Vatican. I succeeded in my suit against the church here in Ireland, where they admitted negligence in the case, made a public statement and paid damages. But the most crucial part was that for the first time ever, the church publicly admitted negligence, which was an important victory in legal terms. Up until that point, the church had always settled cases out of court with confidentiality agreements. But this was the first time they'd ever had to, and that was part of my settlement with them, they had to publicly acknowledge negligence and publicly acknowledge that they were responsible. That was in 2003 finally. So from the criminal action started in 1995. The civil action my own suit started in my own suit started in 1998, and I won my civil suit, my legal case, in 2003. That took 5 years. The priest, in the meantime, was prosecuted, and for 4 years he dragged those cases through the courts. And then finally, when it came to court and it became very clear to him that he would be convicted, the weight of evidence against him was extraordinary. He, in what I think was an absolute final act of refusal to be held accountable, he committed suicide by taking an overdose of pills and alcohol. But the legal case continued against the church up until 2003.
So what was the end result? The end result meaning, did you stop there? Because I know you were doing suing the Pope. And you did the documentary.
The legal case against the Vatican ended when they asserted diplomatic immunity, because there was no way, once they had asserted diplomatic immunity, they could not be brought before the courts. But for me, that was the victory, was the admission of negligence on the part of the church, and to expose the fact publicly that the Vatican, that the Pope, who's meant to be the representative of Christ on earth, was going to use man-made law and a political law to refuse to tell the truth about horrific crimes against children and what his institution knew about it. So for me, that was the victory. Exposing that hypocrisy, exposing that deceit and that callousness and that cowardice was the important victory, at the same time as securing the admission of negligence. Because remember that whatever happens in any diocese, anywhere in the world, be it Ireland, be it Brazil, Uruguay, Chile, whatever happens in any diocese happens in a system where the bishop is accountable to one person and one person alone, the Pope. The model of the Catholic Church is individual dioceses across the world who report directly and only to the Vatican. They don't report to other bishops in their own country. The model is a bishop in his diocese and Rome. Rome is the boss. Rome controls everything. So Rome has responsibility. So if a bishop in Ireland is negligent, Rome has a responsibility for that negligence.
And so you were able to expose the hypocrisy, which is, I like the fact that you said that, because the documentary was called Suing the Pope, correct? Okay, and this was in 2003?
2002, that documentary.
So back then that would have been a different Pope than the one...
It was John Paul II, yeah.
Right. Okay, so now when we're dealing with Ratzinger, who's the one that penned the Crimen Solicitationis back in '62.
No, he didn't. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger didn't pen Crimen Solicitationis. That was in 1962. He came into his role in the Vatican in the early 1980s. From the early 1980s on, he was head of a Vatican department. I'll do that again. From the early 1980s on, he was head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. This is a Vatican department that is responsible for the enforcement of church law and church dogma at the global level. It used to be called the Congregation for the Holy. It used to be known as the Office of the Inquisition, of the Holy Inquisition. So it was the office that was responsible for the medieval Inquisitions. I mean, it's that ancient an institution. And in that role, he was therefore responsible for church law and church canonical law in dealing with crimes by priests at the global level. In 2001, he issued a letter to every bishop in the world called Sanctorum Tutela, which they've just again reissued. And that letter reinforced the rules of the 1962 document and updated them. So it updated that document and kept it in force. Crucially, the letter told bishops that the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, his department, would continue to have exclusive competence in deciding how cases were to be handled. Now that's very important language. He was head of the department. He wrote to every bishop to tell them that every case anywhere in the world of a priest who raped or abused a child, or who was accused of raping and abusing a child, had to be referred to his department, which would, not from this point on, have exclusive competence, but continue to have exclusive competence in how such cases were to be handled. So here was an acknowledgement, first of all, that the 1962 document was in place, and secondly, that the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith at the Vatican level had absolute authority in deciding how cases were to be handled wherever they happened anywhere in the world. So that was a key moment where we could prove responsibility and therefore look for accountability. And it was on foot of both that revelation and what we discovered through the state investigations that we secured here in Ireland that I decided to go out and prosecute that in the media by proving the connection between cases at the global level, by demonstrating that exactly the same approach was adopted in cases in Ireland 20 years ago, in the United States around the same period, in Brazil in the early part of the last decade, so in 2003, 2004, 2005, and that this was a common global system with the Vatican at the heart, and at the heart of the response was the then Pope John Paul II through the office of Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who now has become Pope Benedict XVI. So for more than 20 years, Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger, has been at the forefront of directing how these cases are to be handled at a global level.
Can he be pulled in?
Unlikely. I mean, this is where it starts to get very interesting now, because I have a strong sense that the Vatican's manipulation of its status as a state may be about to frankly bite it on the ass finally. Because with statehood comes state obligations, and there isn't immunity when it comes to state obligations. So there are two particular areas that I think will prove very difficult now for the Vatican, for the current Pope. First of all, the Vatican is a signatory to and has ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Children. And it's very clear that the Vatican is in violation of its obligations under that international treaty. That treaty provides for very obvious things like states must put in place systems to ensure proper child protection. They must put in place proper responses to concerns or to allegations or to acts of child rape or exploitation. They must provide reparation for victims, so that means compensation but guarantees of non-repetition. They must provide supports for children who have been abused. They must ensure that perpetrators are brought to justice and held appropriately to account before the law. Things that the Vatican has clearly failed to do. So it seems to me that the Vatican is in clear breach of this significant obligation under international law. Secondary to that, the Vatican may well also find it has a case to answer under other instruments of international law. Sexual violence and child sexual abuse and rape are considered acts of torture. And any entity, any state, whether it has ratified a particular convention or not, is bound by international law that prohibits torture. So states have an obligation to prohibit and prevent torture, and to investigate, prosecute those who perpetrate torture, and to respond to victims of torture. Many international lawyers are now looking at whether the Vatican city-state and the Pope as the head of that state could face action under international law and be prosecuted for breaches of international law. Now that's technically possible, and this is why you're hearing suggestions that when the Pope goes to the United Kingdom this year, he could be arrested and brought before the International Criminal Court. There's a concept called universal jurisdiction, which means that states have an obligation to arrest and prosecute others who are responsible for grave breaches of international law. And heads of government do not have, or heads of state do not have immunity from such prosecutions. That's why Pinochet was arrested in Spain, for instance. And both Spain and the United Kingdom have quite well developed approaches to universal jurisdiction. So it is indeed technically possible that the Pope could face legal action and legal sanction under international law when he travels to the United Kingdom in September. It seems such a fantastic idea that it appears almost unthinkable. Then, when I decided to sue the Pope back in 1998, people told me that I was crazy and this was ridiculous, and where would that ever get to? And there's no point in taking on the Catholic Church because you'll never get anywhere. But because it's such a powerful institution. I mean, I was, one 28-year-old dysfunctional man running from a very traumatic past, trying to take on the biggest institution in the world, and one of the oldest institutions in the world. So on one level, they were right. It was a ridiculous thing to do, but it was the right thing to do, because truth and justice matter. And if we're not prepared to stand for truth and stand for justice, then we become part of the problem. And no matter how powerful the perpetrator or how powerful the state that's responsible, unless we're each individually prepared to stand up and name wrong and demand change and use our outrage to drive us forward and ask others to join us in demanding truth and justice, then nothing will ever change in this world. So it may seem fantastic and it may have seemed ridiculous back in 1998 to consider taking on the church, but I think we've proven at this point that it was not ridiculous and it was important, and nobody could have predicted quite how far we'd get then.
Yeah. I think it's crucial because I know what your documentary has been viewed worldwide now. Even BBC maybe exploited it, but then it got, I believe it was prohibited in certain other.
What happened was when the film came out first. I mean, it was a little bit ahead of its time, to be honest, because we made the film in 2006 and it aired in late 2006 initially, and there was a very angry reaction from the church. I mean, the Catholic Church in the United Kingdom accused the BBC of bias. There were very high-level complaints that went into the BBC. The BBC takes complaints very seriously.